Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed and today we're going to be continuing with our Primarch videos with a quick look at Magnus the Red, who was the Primarch of the Thousand Suns Legion. He was also known as the Crimson King, the Sorcerer King, the Cyclopean Magnus and Red Cyclops. And he was physically one of the larger specimens of Primarch, and whilst not as large as the Emperor, he rivaled many of his brothers in both height and build. He was gifted as the strongest Psyker among his Primarch brothers, and was also a zealous pursuer of knowledge, especially about the warp and the powers that stem from it. His fascination led to a mistake that cost him the trust of the Emperor, which led to the downfall of his legion and the damnation of himself. When Magnus was cast from the Emperor's laboratory, he arrived on the desert planet of Prospero. He, uniquely among his brothers, remembered both his birth and his development, having full recollections of his infancy even as he grew into an adult. He was even able to reach out with his psychic powers and commune directly with the Emperor long before they were ever reunited. Prospero was the perfect habitat for the young Primarch. Any other world would have shunned or feared his psychic power, but Prospero was a world of outcast human psykers, and all, to a greater or lesser degree, could manipulate the powers of the warp. Magnus's pod landed in their central city's main plaza, and after the shock of his arrival died down, the young Psyker was taken to be mentored by the Psyker scholar Aemon, famous on Prospero for his research and powers. Magnus quickly grew in Aemon's tutelage, and very soon surpassed all others to become the most powerful Psyker on Prospero. He even mastered peering into the warp to glean knowledge rather than just channeling the powers of the warp into the material universe, making him master of a power that few on Prospero had. He also led a purge of the warp creatures known as Psychuine from the planet, who had infested the world and wrought havoc among its population for generations. This allowed the people of Prospero to rebuild their once great cities that had fallen to ruin during the Psychuine infestation. Famously, they were able to rebuild Tizcan, famed as the most beautiful city on Prospero. Now, the survivors of the conflict with the Psychuine became the founders of the cult of the Thousand Suns that would later influence the name of the Primarchs Legion. As mentioned before, Magnus and the Emperor had known about one another long before the Emperor had arrived on the world. When he first set foot physically on the planet, he and Magnus embraced and spoke as if old friends rather than meeting for the first time. When he was presented with his legion, he found them rife with physical mutations and deformities. Magnus took the legion in and began to train them all as psykers, ignoring the horrified remarks of those outside his legion. Both he and the Emperor reached out into the warp together to find an answer for this problem. The Emperor did warn Magnus of the dangers, but the Primarch still made a deal with what he later knew to be Tzeentch, the Chaos God of Change. This deal cost him his right eye. Little did Magnus know the magnitude of the deal he had struck, but still the mutations his legion suffered went into remission, apparently cured, although later evidence showed this was not the case. Magnus was a successful commander in the Crusade. Despite his wild and impetuous combat style, he won many victories, and became close friends with Horus, Lorgar, and Jagatai Khan amongst his other brothers. Despite the Emperor's warnings to shun other Psykers, however, Magnus came across many cultures in his crusade that had psychic powers. Using these cultures, he amassed a great deal of knowledge on the Immaterium as he prosecuted the Great Crusade. This knowledge would eventually form into his seminal work on psychic power and phenomena known as the Book of Magnus. As Magnus encountered more and more strange warp creatures as he travelled, some of his brothers began to whisper about his powers summoning these creatures behind his back. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves especially distrusted Magnus, calling his powers deceitful and trickery, not worthy of a warrior to use. This almost led to blows on Archreach Secundus when the fate of its great library fell on both Magnus and Russ to decide, with both their own views on what should happen differing very greatly. They were only prevented from coming to blows by the arrival of their brother Lorgar. To resolve the issue on psychic powers, the Emperor called a council to be formed on the discussion of how powers could be used in the Imperium. Meeting on the world of Nikaea, this Council of Nikaea ruled that only astropaths and navigators would be allowed to use psychic abilities in the Imperium. The librarians of the Librarium in each Space Marine Legion, which Magnus had helped create, were to be disbanded and they were banned from ever using their powers again, as were all other psykers, including Magnus, in the Imperium. Magnus was greatly dissatisfied with this result, but held true to the Imperium, disbanding the Librarium of his legion and even dissuading his brother Lorgar from researching the powers of the warp for fear they may corrupt him. Now, when Magnus returned to Prospero after the council, he intended to continue his research in secrecy. However, his research soon showed him a vision of the Horus Heresy and the horrors surrounding that time. Magnus attempted to avert such an outcome by using a dangerous ritual to intercede in a chaos-powered healing ritual of the mortally wounded Horus to try and prevent him from siding with chaos. He failed, and Horus chose to take the darker path. Fearful of this, Magnus then tried to warn the Emperor with an astral projection much faster than an astropathic message. However, he found himself blocked by a piece of the webway, unknown to him, created by the Emperor in an attempt to access the Eldar's webway, and stopping humanity from ever having to rely on warp travel ever again. However, this webway blocked Magnus's progress to Terra, but a voice from the warp offered him the power to breach the webway so he could warn the Emperor. Overconfident in his ability to control his power, Magnus accepted the voice's offer. This allowed him to breach the webway, tearing a hole in it and allowing him to follow the corridor back to the portal beneath the Golden Throne on Terra. However, this breach allowed the demons of the warp to flood inside, destroying the webway project and allowing demons direct access to Terra. Horrified by his blunder, Magnus immediately fled without delivering his warning back to his physical body, leaving the Emperor and his custodes to battle the demonic invasion alone. Knowing who had caused the breach but not why, the Emperor sent Leman Russ to arrest Magnus and return him to Terra. En route, Horus, corrupted now by chaos, informed Russ that the Emperor had changed his mind and wanted the Thousand Suns and their Primarch destroyed. What ensued was the burning of Prospero, a one-sided battle where Magnus watched in horror as his world was bombarded by the Space Wolves' fleet, its cities falling and its people dying in fire. He engaged the Space Wolves' Primarch in hand-to-hand combat as they came down to finish their slaughter. As Russ was about to strike his final blow, Magnus and his remaining sons were transported into the warp thanks to a final ritual prepared by Ahriman, one of the Thousand Sons legionaries, Psyker and Librarian. In the warp, Magnus found what he had desired, a place with unrestricted access to psychic power and an opportunity for revenge against those who had wronged him and his people. Magnus gave himself to the forces of chaos, and took all that he had left from the Imperium into the warp forever, including his sons. His physical form had been destroyed in the battle with Russ, but now he existed as an incorporeal entity in the warp, taking whatever form he needed. He appeared in the ruins of Prospero as a projection to convince Jagatai Khan to choose a side in the heresy. He also appeared as a mental projection to the Salamanders, asking them whether they would sacrifice themselves to resurrect Vulcan, their Primarch. The projection led them out of the ruined storm engulfing the Imperium, and did lead to one of their captains sacrificing his life for Vulcan's. Finally, Magnus returned to the material plane as a Daemon Prince of Tzeentch, leading his Thousand Sons at the Siege of Terra. After that was broken, they returned to the warp, to the Sorcerer's World, for Magnus to plot his revenge on the material universe, which had wronged and shunned him. That is all I have to say today on Magnus the Red. I hope that's been informative for you all. If you have a comment or question, you can leave it in the comment section below or send me a personal message directly. For those interested, the next roleplay will be happening on the 6th of June at 6:30 PM BST, or British Summer Time. In any case, thank you for watching today. See you next time on the Vaults of Terra.